A Rose Among Thorns by Everett Cole. The autumn of 1855 brought with it a peculiar chill to the small town of Cedar Ridge, nestled within the rolling hills of Virginia. Eliza Montgomery pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped onto the wooden platform of the train station. The locomotive behind her hissed and belched black smoke into the crisp air, a mechanical beast resting after its long journey from Philadelphia. Eliza's gaze swept across the unfamiliar landscape, searching for a familiar face among the sparse crowd. Her uncle had promised to meet her, but the platform held only strangers, men in wide-brimmed hats and women with modest bonnets, all stealing curious glances at the newcomer in their midst. "Miss Montgomery." A deep voice startled her from behind. Eliza turned to find a tall man with broad shoulders and a serious expression. His dark hair was neatly trimmed beneath a fashionable hat, and his clothes, though not ostentatious, spoke of quiet prosperity. "Yes, I am Eliza Montgomery," she replied, straightening her posture despite her fatigue from the journey. "I'm Robert Thornfield. Your uncle sends his apologies. He's taken ill and asked me to escort you to his estate." The man's expression softened slightly as he reached for her trunk. "I hope your journey was pleasant." "As pleasant as one might expect," Eliza responded, studying Mr. Thornfield with undisguised curiosity. Her uncle had never mentioned any friends or associates in his letters. "You are acquainted with my uncle?" "I am the neighboring landowner. Our families have been friends for generations." He offered his arm. "The carriage is waiting. Cedar Ridge may not offer the excitement of Philadelphia, but it has its own particular charms." Eliza accepted his arm with a cautious smile. "I am not seeking excitement, Mr. Thornfield. I came here for peace and a fresh beginning." As they walked toward a handsome black carriage, Robert Thornfield's gaze lingered on her face longer than propriety allowed. "Then, perhaps, Miss Montgomery, you have come to the right place after all." The Montgomery estate revealed itself after a winding journey through dense woods and open meadows. Willow Creek, as her uncle had named it, was a proud three-story house with generous verandas and tall windows that caught the late afternoon sunlight. "It's beautiful," Eliza murmured as the carriage approached. "Your uncle has maintained it well, despite his recent struggles," Robert replied, his voice lowering. "I should warn you, his condition has worsened in recent days." Concern furrowed Eliza's brow. His letters mentioned only a mild indisposition. "Frederick has always minimized his troubles," Robert said. "It is why I've been helping manage his affairs these past months." As the carriage halted before the house, Eliza's thoughts raced. She had arrived expecting to assist her aging uncle with correspondence and household management, not to find him gravely ill and his business in the hands of a stranger. Mrs. Harper, the housekeeper, greeted them at the door with a warm smile that did not quite reach her worried eyes. "Miss Montgomery, welcome to Willow Creek. Your uncle is resting, but he's eager to see you." Eliza followed the older woman through the foyer, aware of Robert Thornfield's presence close behind her. The house was elegant yet comfortable, with polished wood and tasteful furnishings speaking of refinement rather than ostentation. "He's in the study," Mrs. Harper said, gesturing toward a door. "He insisted on being there rather than confined to bed." When Eliza entered, she found her uncle seated in a leather armchair near a window. Frederick Montgomery was thinner than she remembered from his last visit to Philadelphia 5 years prior. His face was gaunt, his once robust frame diminished, yet his eyes lit up at the sight of her. "Eliza, my dear girl," he extended a trembling hand. She crossed the room swiftly, taking his hand between both of hers. "Uncle Frederick, you should have told me you were unwell. And have you rushed here out of duty instead of desire?" He smiled weakly. "I wanted you to come because you wished to experience Virginia, not because you pitied an old man." Robert cleared his throat from the doorway. "I'll leave you two to become reacquainted. Miss Montgomery, should you need anything, Mrs. Harper knows how to reach me." After he departed, Frederick watched his niece with shrewd eyes. "So, you've met Robert Thornfield?" "Yes, he was quite the gentleman, escorting me here." Eliza removed her bonnet, setting it aside. "He's a good man. Educated at Yale, returned to manage his family estate when his father passed. The Thornfields have been our neighbors for 3 generations. Frederick's breathing grew labored. "He's been indispensable these past months." "You must rest, uncle," Eliza urged, concerned by his pallor. "Rest is all I seem to do these days," he replied with a hint of his old humor. "But now you're here, and I can stop worrying about what will become of Willow Creek when I'm gone." "You're not going anywhere," Eliza insisted, though the gravity in his eyes told her otherwise. "My dear, we must be practical. I've made arrangements. Willow Creek will pass to you upon my death. It's a substantial responsibility, and you'll need guidance." He paused, his gaze drifting to the window, where the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. "Robert has offered his assistance." Eliza felt a flutter of unease. "I'm capable of managing my own affairs, Uncle." "Of course you are. You're a Montgomery," he said with pride. "But even the most capable person needs allies in unfamiliar territory. Virginia isn't Philadelphia. The customs, the people, they're different here." As if summoned by their conversation, Mrs. Harper appeared with a tea tray. "Miss Montgomery, I've prepared your room. Perhaps your uncle should rest before dinner?" Frederick nodded reluctantly. "We'll continue our discussion tomorrow when I'm stronger." That night, Eliza stood at her bedroom window, watching the moonlight cast silver patterns across the expansive grounds of Willow Creek. In the distance she could see the faint glow of lights from what must be the Thornfield estate. Robert Thornfield's face came unbidden to her mind, his strong jaw, dark eyes that seemed to evaluate and appreciate simultaneously, the hint of a smile that never fully materialized. He was handsome, certainly, but it was his quiet confidence that intrigued her. Shaking away such thoughts, Eliza reminded herself why she had come to Virginia. After the dissolution of her engagement to Edward Hartley, a man who had proven more interested in her family's Philadelphia connections than in Eliza herself, she had sworn to guard her feelings more carefully. She had come to Willow Creek seeking refuge from society's prying eyes, not to entangle herself with another man, no matter how intriguing. With a sigh, she turned from the window. Her uncle needed her, and that would be her focus. Robert Thornfield, with his penetrating gaze and commanding presence, would remain simply a neighbor, nothing more. The days that followed established a routine at Willow Creek. Mornings found Eliza at her uncle's side, reading correspondence aloud or discussing estate matters. Afternoons she often spent exploring the property, familiarizing herself with the operations of the plantation. The harvest was underway, and though slavery had never been practiced at Willow Creek, her uncle being firmly opposed to the institution, the paid workers and tenant farmers were busy bringing in the tobacco crop that was the estate's primary source of income. It was during one such afternoon exploration that she encountered Robert again. He was speaking with the overseer, Jacob Miller, at the edge of a field. Upon seeing Eliza, he excused himself and approached her. "Miss Montgomery," he greeted her, removing his hat. "You seem to be settling in." "I am," she replied, "though there is much to learn." "Your uncle mentioned you were quite accomplished in Philadelphia, a patron of the arts and involved in various charitable societies." Eliza raised an eyebrow. "You've discussed me with my uncle?" A slight flush colored Robert's cheeks. "Frederick speaks highly of you. He's proud of your intelligence and independence." "Characteristics not always appreciated in a woman," Eliza noted, watching his reaction carefully. "Perhaps not in certain circles," Robert conceded. "But your uncle and I share the opinion that a woman's mind is as worthy of education and respect as a man's." Surprised by his progressive view, Eliza found herself warming to him slightly. "And yet, I notice you've taken considerable control over my uncle's affairs." At his request and temporarily, Robert clarified, "I have no intention of interfering once you are established here. I merely wish to ensure a smooth transition." They walked together toward a cluster of maple trees blazing with autumn color. Robert pointed out boundaries, explained water sources and detailed crop rotations with the precision of someone intimately familiar with agricultural science. "You speak like a professor, Mr. Thornfield," Eliza observed. "I studied agricultural science at Yale, alongside classical literature," he explained. "My father believed in practical education combined with cultural refinement." "A wise man?" "He was." Something in Robert's tone suggested a deep loss. "He passed 3 years ago, leaving me the estate and his considerable debts." Eliza glanced at him with newfound respect. "And you've managed to preserve your family home?" "Through considerable effort and some innovative farming techniques," he acknowledged. "Your uncle was generous with his advice and occasional financial assistance during the most difficult times." This revelation shifted Eliza's perception of the relationship between the two men. Not a case of a neighbor taking advantage of her uncle's illness, but rather a friendship forged through mutual respect and support. "My uncle didn't mention his role in helping you," she said softly. "Frederick Montgomery is not a man who broadcasts his generosity. Robert's expression softened. He is, however, a man who worries about those he loves. He fears leaving you vulnerable in an unfamiliar place. They had reached a small rise overlooking both properties, Willow Creek to the east, and what must be the Thornfield estate to the west. In the distance, a stately home similar in size to her uncle's stood surrounded by gardens and orchards. "Thornfield Hall," Robert said, following her gaze. "Not as grand as some, but it has been in my family since 1789. "It's lovely," Eliza replied sincerely. "Perhaps you would do me the honor of visiting. My mother would be delighted to meet you. She has few female companions of suitable age and education in the area." The invitation was proper, yet Eliza hesitated. "That would be pleasant, though I'm reluctant to leave my uncle for extended periods." "Of course. When Frederick is feeling stronger, perhaps." Robert turned to face her directly, his expression earnest. "Miss Montgomery, I hope you will come to see me as an ally, not an intruder in your family's affairs." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and Eliza found herself nodding. "I believe I might, Mr. Thornfield, given time." His smile then, the first full, unguarded smile she had seen from him, transformed his serious countenance into something unexpectedly charming. "Time is something I hope we shall have in abundance, Miss Montgomery." As they walked back toward Willow Creek, conversing easily about books and music, Eliza felt a dangerous warmth growing within her, a feeling she had sworn to guard against. Yet in Robert Thornfield's company, her resolve seemed increasingly difficult to maintain. October gave way to November, and Frederick Montgomery's health declined steadily. The local physician, Dr. Reynolds, visited regularly but offered little hope beyond making the elder Montgomery comfortable. Eliza divided her time between caring for her uncle and learning the intricacies of managing Willow Creek. To her surprise, Robert proved an invaluable teacher, never condescending or impatient, as he explained accounting practices, crop management, and the complex social structures of Virginia society. Their relationship evolved gradually from formal acquaintance to something approaching friendship. They discovered shared interests in literature and music. Robert often brought books from his family's extensive library, volumes of poetry and scientific journals that provided welcome distraction during the long evenings of her uncle's decline. One particularly crisp November afternoon, Eliza finally accepted Robert's invitation to Thornfield Hall. Her uncle, having rallied slightly that morning, insisted she go. "You cannot spend every moment at an old man's bedside," he told her. "Augusta Thornfield is a fine woman who will introduce you to suitable society." Thornfield Hall proved even more impressive up close. Though not as large as some of the plantation homes Eliza had glimpsed during her journey through Virginia, it possessed an elegance that spoke of refined taste rather than ostentatious display. Augusta Thornfield, a slender woman with silver-streaked dark hair and her son's penetrating eyes, welcomed Eliza warmly. "At last I meet the niece Frederick speaks of so fondly," she said, taking Eliza's hands in hers. "My son has become quite the admirer as well." "Mother," Robert admonished gently, though his expression remained pleasant. "I merely state what is obvious to anyone with eyes," Augusta replied with a mischievous smile. "Come, Miss Montgomery, you must see our conservatory. Robert had it built for me 2 years ago, despite our financial constraints at the time." As they toured the house, Eliza noted touches that revealed both prosperity and careful economy. The furnishings were of excellent quality but not new, paintings and books abounded, suggesting a family that valued culture over extravagance. The conservatory was a marvel, a glass-enclosed garden where lemon trees and exotic flowers flourished, despite the November chill outside. Augusta's pride in this space was evident as she described the plants and their care. "My husband loved gardens," she explained, touching a fragrant blossom. "After his passing I found solace here among growing things." "It's beautiful," Eliza said sincerely. Augusta studied her thoughtfully. "You've brought a change to my son, Miss Montgomery. Since you arrived, he smiles more frequently." Eliza felt her cheeks warm. "I've done nothing to deserve credit for any change in Mr. Thornfield's demeanor." "Sometimes presence alone is enough," Augusta replied cryptically. "Robert has carried heavy burdens since his father's death. The estate, the debts, caring for me, he's had little time for personal happiness." Before Eliza could respond, Robert appeared at the conservatory entrance. "Are you overwhelming our guest with horticultural details, Mother?" "We were discussing more interesting subjects," Augusta responded with a knowing smile. "I'll leave you to show Miss Montgomery the library. I believe you mentioned her interest in Byron? Alone in the book-lined room with Robert, Eliza felt a curious tension, not unpleasant, but unsettling nonetheless. He moved differently here in his own domain, more relaxed yet somehow more intense. My father collected first editions, he explained, indicating a glass-fronted cabinet, including this. He carefully removed a volume, opening it to reveal Byron's She Walks in Beauty. And all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes, Robert quoted softly, his gaze meeting Eliza's with unmistakable meaning. She looked away, her pulse quickening. Your father had excellent taste in literature. As do I in all things of beauty, he replied, his voice low. The moment stretched between them, fraught with unspoken possibilities. Eliza found herself standing at a precipice of feeling, simultaneously wishing to step back to safety and forward into the unknown. A discreet cough from the doorway broke the spell. A servant announced that tea was served in the drawing room. Throughout the remainder of the visit, Robert maintained perfect propriety, yet Eliza sensed a shift in their relationship, a current of awareness flowing beneath polite conversation about books and music. As her carriage departed Thornfield Hall that evening, Eliza gazed back at the house where Robert stood on the steps, watching her leave. The setting sun caught his profile, illuminating him against the darkening sky. For the first time since arriving in Virginia, Eliza allowed herself to acknowledge the truth: she was falling in love with Robert Thornfield, despite all her determinations to the contrary. December arrived with bitter cold and the inevitability of loss. Frederick Montgomery's condition deteriorated rapidly, and on a snow-dusted morning he called Eliza to his bedside. "My time grows short," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Uncle, please don't." He raised a trembling hand to silence her. "We must speak plainly now. You've learned much about Willow Creek these past weeks, but managing an estate of this size alone will be challenging." "I am not afraid of challenges," Eliza assured him, though her voice wavered. "No, you never were." Pride shone in his faded eyes. "That is why I know you will thrive here, with or without my guidance. But there is something else I must tell you." Frederick motioned weakly toward his desk. "In the top drawer there's a letter." Eliza retrieved it, noting the yellowed paper and faded ink. "That letter," Frederick continued, "is from Robert's father, written shortly before his death. It details a promise made between our families generations ago. The Montgomerys and Thornfields were once to be united through marriage, my sister and James Thornfield. They loved each other deeply." "What happened?" Eliza asked, captivated by this revelation. "The Civil War was brewing. James joined the Union Army against his father's wishes. He was killed at Bull Run." Frederick's eyes clouded with old grief. "My sister never recovered from the loss. She passed a year later, her spirit broken." Eliza held the letter carefully. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because history doesn't need to repeat itself." Frederick's gaze was suddenly sharp, penetrating. "I've seen how you look at Robert, and how he looks at you. Life is too short to deny one's feelings out of fear or pride." "Uncle, I made arrangements in my will," he continued. "Willow Creek is yours unconditionally. But I've also outlined a proposal. Should you and Robert ever choose to marry, the estates could be managed together, creating a legacy that would secure both families for generations." Eliza felt her face flush. "You're suggesting an arranged marriage?" "No." Frederick's voice strengthened momentarily. "I'm suggesting you listen to your own feelings rather than society's expectations. In Philadelphia, you chose as you were expected to, not as your heart dictated. Here, you're free to follow your inclinations." He sank back against his pillows, exhausted by the conversation. "Promise me only that you will consider happiness above convention, my dear." "I promise," Eliza whispered, her mind reeling from her uncle's revelations. That evening, Dr. Reynolds was summoned urgently to Willow Creek. Through the long night, Eliza sat at her uncle's bedside, reading aloud from his favorite volumes as his breathing grew increasingly labored. Near dawn, the door opened quietly to admit Robert. His expression told Eliza he understood the gravity of the situation. "Mrs. Harper sent word," he explained softly. "I thought you might need support." Gratitude washed over Eliza. Without a word, she moved slightly, making room for him beside her chair. Together, they kept vigil as the first light of morning crept through the windows. Frederick Montgomery passed peacefully as the winter sun broke over the horizon. His hand in Eliza's, his last glance directed at Robert, as if entrusting one to the other. The days that followed passed in a blur of necessary arrangements. Robert handled much of the business with quiet efficiency, allowing Eliza space to grieve while ensuring her uncle received a dignified burial in the family plot, overlooking the creek that gave the estate its name. Neighbors and business associates from throughout the county attended the service, offering condolences, and, in many cases, barely concealed curiosity about Frederick Montgomery's young, unmarried niece and her future plans. "They wonder if you'll sell and return to Philadelphia," Robert observed quietly as they walked back to the house after the funeral guests had departed. "Is that what you think I should do?" Eliza asked, studying his profile. "I think," he replied carefully, "that you should follow your own inclinations, not the expectations of others." His words, so similar to her uncle's final advice, struck a chord within her. They had reached the veranda, and Eliza paused, turning to face him directly. "My uncle showed me a letter," she said, "from your father." Robert's expression shifted subtly. "The old promise between our families. You knew of it." "My father spoke of it often. He believed that some destinies are written generations before we're born." Robert's gaze held hers steadily. "But I believe in choice, not obligation." The winter air was sharp between them, their breath forming small clouds in the fading light. "Then tell me," Eliza challenged softly, "if there were no estates, no familial expectations, what would you choose?" Robert stepped closer, his voice low and intense. "From the moment I saw you standing on that train platform, I have had only one choice in my heart." He took her gloved hand carefully in his. "I have tried to be respectful of your grief, your independence, your need to find your own way in this unfamiliar place. But I cannot pretend indifference when each day in your company only strengthens my admiration and affection." Eliza felt her carefully constructed defenses crumbling. "After Edward, I swore I would never again allow myself to be vulnerable." "Edward was a fool who couldn't recognize the treasure before him," Robert said with unexpected vehemence. "I am not Edward." "No," she agreed, something like hope unfurling within her. "You are nothing like him." "Eliza." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a tremor through her. "I am not asking for your hand, not yet. I am asking only for permission to court you properly, to show you that what grows between us is not born of convenience or arrangement, but of genuine feeling." The sincerity in his eyes, the careful way he held her hand, as if she were something precious that might slip away, moved her deeply. "Yes," she said simply. His smile then was like sunrise breaking through clouds, transforming his serious features into something radiant. Raising her hand to his lips, he pressed a kiss to her gloved fingers. "You have made me the happiest of men," he murmured. In that moment, standing in the winter twilight with the man who had gradually claimed her reluctant affections, Eliza felt a sense of rightness settle over her. Coming to Virginia had been an escape, a retreat from disappointment and social scrutiny. Instead, it had become the beginning of something she had never truly expected to find, a love based not on societal expectations or financial considerations, but on mutual respect, shared values, and a connection that seemed to deepen with each passing day. Spring came early to Virginia that year. By March, the grounds of Willow Creek were awash with new growth, dogwoods blooming white against the fresh green of awakening forests, daffodils nodding in the gentle breeze. Eliza stood on the veranda, watching as Robert directed workers planting new saplings along the avenue leading to the house. Over the winter months, he had proven himself not just a suitor but a partner, respecting her decisions regarding the estate while offering guidance when asked. Their courtship had progressed with a natural ease that surprised her. Robert was attentive without being possessive, interested in her opinions without attempting to override them. They had spirited discussions about literature, agriculture, and even politics, a subject many men considered unsuitable for female minds. Most evenings found them in the library at Willow Creek or Thornfield Hall, sometimes in the company of Augusta, often alone but for the requisite chaperone dozing discreetly in the corner. They read to each other, played chess, and gradually shared the stories that had shaped them into the people they had become. Eliza learned of Robert's time at Yale, his initial reluctance to return to Virginia, and his eventual recognition that the land was in his blood. He spoke of his father's gambling debts that had nearly cost them Thornfield Hall, and his determination to restore his family's fortunes through innovation rather than speculation. In turn, she told him of her childhood in Philadelphia, her passion for art and literature, and her disastrous engagement to Edward Hartley, a man who had courted her for her family connections and then betrayed her with another woman whose social standing promised greater advantages. "I should like to call him out for such dishonor," Robert had said, his expression darkening. Eliza had laughed despite herself. "How delightfully medieval of you, but unnecessary. Edward did me a favor, though I couldn't see it then. Had we married, I would never have come to Virginia, never have known Willow Creek, or you." Now, watching him direct the planting with precise care, she marveled at how thoroughly her life had transformed in a few short months. Philadelphia society, with its rigid expectations and superficial pleasantries, seemed a distant memory. Here she had found purpose in managing the estate, satisfaction in learning agricultural techniques, and unexpected joy in her deepening relationship with Robert. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, shading his eyes against the spring sunshine. The smile that spread across his face at the sight of her still caused her breath to catch. He said something to the foreman and strode toward the house, removing his gloves as he approached. "The avenue will be magnificent in 20 years, he called up to her. "A legacy for future generations." "You're thinking quite far ahead, Mr. Thornfield," she replied, though the thought of future generations sent a pleasant warmth through her. "A man should have vision," he responded, taking the porch steps two at a time to join her. Up close, she could see smudges of dirt on his face and a leaf caught in his dark hair. Without thinking, she reached up to remove it. His hand caught hers, holding it against his cheek. "Marry me, Eliza." The directness of the proposal, no preamble, no carefully prepared speech, was so typically Robert that she nearly laughed. "I had planned to ask you properly," he continued, not releasing her hand. "With your favorite flowers and perhaps a poem. I've been practicing Byron. But seeing you just now, with the sunlight in your hair and that look in your eyes, I couldn't wait another moment." "What look?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The one that makes me believe you might love me too." The vulnerability in his expression melted the last of her reservations. This was not Edward, whose pretty words had masked calculation and ambition. This was Robert, whose actions had consistently demonstrated his character, and whose eyes now revealed the depth of his feelings. "I do love you," she admitted, the words feeling both momentous and perfectly natural. "More than I ever thought possible." Joy transformed his features. In a movement that would have scandalized Philadelphia society, he lifted her off her feet in an exuberant embrace, spinning her once before setting her down. "You haven't answered my question," he reminded her, suddenly serious again. Eliza smiled up at him, her decision made long before he had asked. "Yes, Robert Thornfield. I will marry you." His kiss was gentle but fervent, a promise of deeper passion tempered by respect. When they parted, his eyes held hers with an intensity that sent warmth spreading through her. "Our family's legacies will be united at last," he murmured. "Though not because of an old promise, but because we chose each other." "I think Uncle Frederick and your father would approve of our reasoning," Eliza replied. As they stood together on the veranda of Willow Creek, the spring breeze carrying the scent of new blossoms, Eliza reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had come seeking refuge from disappointment, a place to heal her wounded pride and broken trust. Instead, she had found a home, a purpose, and a love she had never anticipated, a love built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than social convention. In Robert's eyes, she saw not just the man he was, but the life they would build together, Willow Creek and Thornfield Hall united, children running between them, generations of Montgomerys and Thornfields creating a legacy of their own. It was not the future she had once envisioned for herself, but standing there in the arms of the man she had come to love, Eliza knew with absolute certainty that it was infinitely better than anything she could have imagined. The Virginia spring continued to unfold around them, a testimony to renewal and new beginnings. For Eliza Montgomery and Robert Thornfield, it was merely the first chapter of a story that would span generations, a story that began not with obligation or arrangement, but with a chance meeting at a train station and the gradual, powerful awakening of love that would endure long after they were gone.